Akakios taught him how to swim by throwing him in the pool. His patron had laughed and twisted his gray and black beard as Herodotus struggled to float. The librarian showed him how to move his body while on dry land, and Herodotus quickly memorized the movements. But once in the water, he'd had a moment of panic and nearly drowned. Sputtering and spitting water from his lungs, the boy managed not only to float, but swim. More like flailing across the water's surface, but it had been enough. At dawn every day, Akakios woke him and took him to the pool. Akakios himself never entered the water, but taught and corrected him from the water's edge. In time, Akakios ceased waking him. It had become routine. Shortly after that, Akakios stopped coming at all. Herodotus felt a fish bump against his leg. He laughed and quickened his pace. His long brown arms reached forward, cupped hands pulling him, while his legs scissored in the blue water. He reached the edge of the pool, flipped over, and headed back. Although he wasn't afraid to swim in the ocean itself, it was easier to count laps if he stayed within the pool's open rectangle. A splash followed by a yell made him lift his head. Isaac stood at the other end of the pool, teeth chattering and shivering. Herodotus tread water and shook his head at the older man. "You are the reason Jews should not be allowed to swim," Herodotus yelled. "Then why should you be allowed?" Isaac answered in Aramaic. "I think I'm more Greek than Jew." "Heresy!" Isaac shouted and began swimming toward him. Herodotus continued to tread water. Isaac's clumsy strokes made him smile. For 8 years he'd been swimming per Akakios' instruction. Isaac had only learned how to swim last year, and the man refused any instruction at all. "The man swims like he translates," Akakios said after witnessing the Jew's efforts. "Without grace and without poetry. The man is a barbarian." Isaac reached him and tread water beside him. "You're late," Herodotus said. "Sorry, fighting kept me up." Herodotus' smile disappeared. "You heard them too?" "Sword, shield, clang, clang, scream, yes, I heard it." Isaac ducked beneath the water for a moment, and then reappeared. His thinning hair was plastered against his skull. "Did you see the centurions this morning?" "No." "I went to the courtyard before coming here. There are more of them than ever." Herodotus grunted. "Caesar must be out of his mind. There's no way Ptolemy is going to allow him to use the library as a base." "Who knows? Doesn't matter. I rather like the fact they're here. Keeps away the undesirables." "No, it doesn't." "How do you mean?" "You're still here." Herodotus splashed a handful of water in Isaac's face and then began swimming as fast as he could. Isaac yelled and followed with clumsy strokes. When Herodotus reached the edge of the pool, he flipped and kicked off the wall and swam beneath Isaac's flailing body. He was still grinning when he reached the surface for air. The sounds of men shouting to one another were barely audible over the whisper of the braziers. Shadows danced on walls as the flames flickered in the light breeze coming through the window. Herodotus held his hand to shield the table lamp. He scratched a few more elegant Greek symbols onto the papyrus scroll and then sat back in his chair. The bones in his spine popped one by one as he stretched. He groaned with pleasure. Another long day, another long night. The Greek words stared back at him from the scroll. He translated 690 cuneiform tablets over the past 2 months. Ever since the first bundle of clay had been placed at his desk, he'd been obsessed with translating every word as faithfully as he could. The cuneiform symbols that the self-named scribe Tupsoro had written were flawless in every detail. Of all the tablets Herodotus translated over the years, Tupsoro's were the most beautiful and well written. The Akkadian man had written poetry even when describing the most mundane events such as market days or memorable events of Akkadian history. Herodotus felt his translations were inadequate. It would have been far easier to translate the words into Aramaic, but the library's volumes were required to be written in Greek. Herodotus sighed. He rose from his chair and walked to the window. The boats passing toward the harbor blinked. Ptolemy's navy sent signals to the shore, giving orders to the ground troops in the city. The Egyptian soldiers fighting Caesar would renew their attacks in a matter of hours. Akakios had asked him why he rarely slept these days. Herodo blamed it on Tupsuro's wonderful tablets, and it was partially true. But the idea of stalking back to the dormitory only to hear the shouting and clashing steel of Romans fighting Egyptians was anathema. Even if the library campus was off limits to all soldiers but its guards, the war was just a few streets away. Herodo coughed into his hand and wiped his nose. Each day spent translating cuneiform meant breathing in clay dust. Sometimes his nose bled from the dry air and the irritation. The ocean waves broke upon the thin shore outside the library. He watched their froth beneath the bright half-moon. He smiled. The night was his favorite time. The other scribes, students, lecturers, and librarians were tucked into the dormitory or their private homes, leaving the building silent. Without the constant noise of shuffling papyrus, deliveries from the ships, and incessant Greek, Roman, and Egyptian chattering, he felt as though he owned the library. In the night, it was always his, and his alone. Caesar had permanently stationed several centurions around the entrances to the library, although they were merely a precaution to keep Ptolemy's forces from using it to gain unfettered access to their rear flank. The library was not in any danger from either side, although Herodo wondered if Aquila's forces would try and use it as a strategic location to spring attacks on Caesar. Before the death of Pompey and Caesar's intervention in the war between King Ptolemy and his sister, Alexandria had been quiet and peaceful, with only the occasional street fight. Herodo walked back to his table. He blew clay dust from his scroll, rolled it up, and placed it beside the tablet. The lamp flame guttered. He checked the oil level. It was nearly empty. He walked the scroll over to the librarian crate and carefully placed it inside. Tomorrow, the librarians would categorize it and place it with the other Akkadian translations. Tupsuro was quickly getting his own section. Herodo smiled. A bird called out in the night, its wail setting his teeth on edge. Herodo yawned. He lifted up the tablet, secured it against his body, and picked up the nearly spent lamp. Walking heel to toe, Herodo made his way down the hall. He passed empty desks made from Lebanese cedar and East African ebony, pillars made of polished marble, and stone filigree with gold. The shadows moved and swung with the flickering braziers. He stepped to the edge of another hallway and stopped. The way to the artifact room was shrouded in complete darkness. The architects had provided no inlet for natural light. Without lit braziers, it was impossible to see your hands in front of your face, and the servants had forgotten to refill them. He gritted his teeth, held the lamp forward, and walked into the darkness. The lamp barely provided enough light for him to see 2 steps ahead. He raised his eyes from the floor and then stopped. His brows scrunched together as he squinted into the darkness. The artifact room was still many steps away, but there'd been a flicker somewhere down the hall. Another lamp? Hello? The sound of his voice echoing off the stone walls made him shiver. The teardrop lamp flame guttered into an ember and then jumped back to its original shape. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. It's just darkness, he told himself. Nothing to be afraid of in the library. Except maybe Cleotis, he whispered. He grinned in the darkness and kept moving. Cleotis, the smallest and most ferocious head librarian ever to enter Alexandria, was, without a doubt, much more frightening than this. Herodo would rather face 1,000 Roman soldiers and suffer the man's verbal violence. He wondered if Cleotis was also afraid of the dark. After a few more steps, the large entrance to the artifact room yawned before him. He walked through the entrance and shivered from the temperature change. The room was cooler than the rest of the building. A stone baffle captured wind from the ocean and shunted the air into the chamber. Even at the hottest points in summer, the room was pleasant. Holding the lamp before him, he stepped toward the west wall. The tablets taken from Babylon were laid out on small shelves. Herodo looked for the empty slot amongst them, found it, and slid the tablet in between the others. He rubbed at his eyes. The vast shelf went all the way to the far wall. Dozens and dozens more to translate. He smiled. If they were all Tupsoros, it would be a pleasure. Something moved behind him. Erido turned, his heart hammering in his chest. He held the lamp forward from his waist, trying to keep the light from blinding his night vision. "Hello?" he asked in Egyptian. No response. He asked the darkness again in Greek. Nothing moved or made a sound. Erido walked backwards until he felt the edge of the shelves. He sidestepped until he met the south wall. He exhaled a deep breath and pointed the lamp toward the room's entrance. There was only darkness. A scratching sound came from the portal in the floor. He held his breath. Another bird screeched, and he relaxed. "Just a damn bird," he muttered. The architects had put a grate in the floor in case of a flood. Another grate at the far end of the library was affixed to the crawl space to keep animals from the artifact room, but maybe an ibis chick had managed to get in. He turned and headed back into the hallway. The lamp went out. Erido cursed and stood still. At the far end, he could see the flickering light from the lit braziers in the other hallway, but they seemed a world away. The pressure on his lungs increased as he felt the panic animal try to take control. "Jewish scum," a voice whispered in his mind. He clenched his eyes against it. "Just children," he told himself. Just memory." The voices quieted. Erido opened his eyes and fixed them on the light ahead. He willed his feet to move, and with heavy steps, he began the long walk down the hallway. Halfway toward the exit, he heard the scratching sound from behind him. It was louder. Erido lost his nerve. He ran. The firelight danced up and down as his legs pumped. He gulped down air and shot it out of his mouth just as fast. Closer, closer. He reached the edge of the scribe's hallway and turned to enter. A glow caught his peripheral vision, and he turned to look down the dark passage. Light flickered from the artifact room's entrance. Erido blinked. The scratching sound he'd heard before was barely audible. His skin tingled with fear. He opened his mouth to ask who was there, and then closed it. He turned and quickly made his way back into the scribe hall. He dropped the lamp onto an empty desk and fled toward the rear stairs. He didn't want to know what was in the artifact room. The braziers lit his way, but the memory of the absolute darkness would not leave him. Erido took the stairs as fast as he dared. The winding staircase brought him to the library's ground level. "Sir," a low voice growled. All the air rushed out of his lungs. He swung his head left. A Roman soldier stood near the library's entrance. The soldier frowned. "Are you all right, sir?" Erido stopped and cleared his throat. "Sorry, well," the soldier furrowed his brow. "Yes, I'm well, Centurion." The man nodded. "Heading back to the dormitory?" "Yes," he said again. "It's been a long day." "Sorry to have startled you." Erido managed to smile. "It gets a little lonely in the hall at night." "I'm sure it does." "Did anyone come upstairs?" The soldier shook his head. "Is there something I need to know?" "No, just my imagination, I guess." The soldier said nothing. "Good night, Centurion." "Good night, sir." Erido turned and walked across the large library lobby. Whereas the scribe hall was barely lit at night, the library's entrance was bathed with fresh braziers and torches. The Roman soldiers were responsible for the library's safety and had been for decades. Once the war with Ptolemy began, the soldiers were more numerous, and their attention to those details had become fanatical. As he walked across the marble floor, he sighed with relief. The adrenaline surge had passed, leaving him exhausted.